Hi, welcome to today's video. I have a fantastic guest with me today. You will recognize him if you've been a subscriber for a while. His name is Jesus. He is an American accent specialist. Originally, he is from Colombia, but has spent basically his entire life perfecting his American accent and now teaches other non native speakers how to sound more fluent, more natural, more native when they are speaking. In our last video, we talked about his journey to fluency. So I will link that video below if you want to go and watch that. But in today's video, we will be focusing on the difference between American English and British English, and if you need to pay attention to those differences. I know it can be very difficult sometimes when you're trying to learn a language and constantly learning that there's this difference and it's too much. I can't focus on it all. So today we're going to go through some of the main differences. We have some fun phrasal verbs for you, and we will discuss why it is different. So hi, Jesus. It's been a while since our last video where we focused on your journey as a non-native English speaker, learning how to become fluent and be able to express yourself the way you want to. And today, I'm happy to have you back on the channel to talk a bit about the difference between American English and British English. So how are you, first of all? How have you been?
I'm doing pretty well. Thank you for asking. And actually, I think it has been 6 months since we sat down for that interview. I think it has been 6 months. And so, yes, I'm very excited to be back and have another, great conversation.
Wow, that's a lot longer than I thought. I thought maybe 1 or 2 months, but no, time
No, it
flies.
has been a while. It has been a minute.
Wow. Okay, fantastic. So, as I said, today we're going to go through the differences between American and British English. And I know this is something that a lot of people struggle with. They don't see why there has to be differences. It's very confusing as to why there's differences. So hopefully today we can break down why some of those differences exist. So you have some information for us initially about these differences.
Yes, absolutely. So, just to give as general an overview as possible, the English language comes into this continent from England. That's easy enough to understand. And the divergences begin in the 17th century, the 1600s. We get the first British colonies or English colonies here in North America. They interact with lots of Native American nations and tribes. And so there's already that contact between English and non-English languages. And so we are going to see lots of words in American English that ultimately derive, for example, from Native American words. And also, we have to remember that we had a whole plethora of different people from other European countries settling here. And so you have, again, contact between English, Dutch, French, German, Swedish. It's actually quite incredible. It really is interesting. But all of those factors come together, and the differences are inevitable. They are bound to happen. And also, distance is a great contributing factor. You have two communities, let's think of them that way, relatively isolated. I mean, it's a really long distance. I mean, it means nothing these days because we can cover that, I believe, it's like a 6 or 7 hour flight. But back then, in the 1600s, you were talking about a voyage of at least 2 months. It's a long time considering. One last thing to consider is that there were also people involved in initiatives or actions that also led to some changes in American English. And so, as a lot of people are aware, we have Noah Webster in the United States, who writes his American Dictionary of the English Language way back in the 18th century. My guess is that he probably was more of a popularizer of different ways to spell words and to simplify the spelling. Just think of the classic example of color and color, O-U-R, in the UK, or here in America, or theater spelled ER instead of RE. And there are other examples just like it. But as far as an overview is concerned, that explains, why we ended up, where we are today.
Exactly. Yes, I've heard a lot about Noah Webster, and I believe Noah Webster is the kind of Collins version of our dictionary. So we have the Collins Dictionary, the Cambridge Oxford English Dictionary, and for Americans, it's the Noah Webster or the Webster or Merriam-Webster Dictionary, isn't it?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know who Miriam was. I don't know if it was the same person or somebody else, but yes, it is. I think it is safe to say that it is one of the most, let's say, renowned dictionaries here in the United States. And I believe it started because I have actually consulted it myself a lot in the past. And I still have the app on my phone, for instance. And I believe it started in 1821, or maybe it's the 1830s. But the point is that we are either at the point of the bicentennial or just a little bit beyond that point.
Absolutely, absolutely. So you mentioned color, theatre versus theatre. Could you give us another example that perhaps was lost in the British English but stayed in the American version of the language?
Yes, easy example there is the pronunciation of post-vocalic R, just the sound. And so initially, I don't know really to what extent this was the case, but let's say that the majority of the different regional accents in the 17th century, around Shakespeare's time, they were rhotic, meaning you have the R pronounced before consonants and at the ends of words. And so it would have actually sounded a lot like what you would consider, a stereotypical American accent. And so that was very much present there. The decline in rhoticity, I believe the estimates put to somewhere starting in the mid 18th century, the 1750s or 40s, in the south of England. That's where it begins. And then it just simply spreads around the country. There are still some pockets of people in England to this day that have, let's say, a higher degree of rhoticity in their speech, but they're relatively isolated instances. They're definitely not the norm. But let's just say that 400 years ago, the English sounded like Americans. Let's just put it that way.
Wow, that's amazing. I never actually knew that. So you mean, for example, in the word hard, I don't pronounce the R, but 400 years ago, Americans and British would have that really strong R, almost rolled R sound in hard.
Yes, exactly. There would have been more similarities in the pronunciation. My take is that it would have been virtually indistinguishable. And there's actually another example that I can refer to here. There's a very renowned linguist from Wales. I might have mentioned his name at some point, but his name is David Crystal. He is the author of the Cambridge Encyclopedia of the English Language. That's a very big book. I think I once saw a used copy of the second edition. I mean, it's a massive tome. I think it probably numbers, I'm pretty sure, over 1,000 pages. I don't know if he's like the author of it. Most likely he's like an editor or compiler, but he definitely would have been quite involved in the drafting composition of the test. And I want to say maybe around 2011 or 12, he started to show that the original pronunciation of Shakespeare shows these things and other changes that we're not really going to get into today. But that rhotic sound, that is something that, based on the research that he's conducted, was very much a staple in the accents. And so that was just part of everyday speech, which is really interesting to think about because we're so used to, let's say, a non-rhotic British accent or accents, but that was actually the norm at the time. The changes come later, but let's just put it this way: a play in original pronunciation would have had or has an extremely different feeling.
That's very interesting because I think we always think, or at least I do, that Americans changed the language to be more Americanized, but perhaps American English is closer to the traditional version of the language, and the British were the ones that actually started to change the language. And one thing that we haven't mentioned, of course, is the American Revolution and the Industrial Revolution were happening around a similar time. And both countries were trying to establish themselves as these powerful entities and build manufacturing industries. And I think one of the things that happens when anyone, any country, any group of people wants to individualize themselves is the language changes. And so this is also an effect, is both countries which were trying to be more powerful than the other and establish themselves in the world. And in doing so, they created these changes in the language that nowadays possibly seems irritating or annoying, but it comes from a very powerful history and a very pivotal moment in history.
Yes, and I'm sure that there's always been on both sides this desire to differentiate, from one another. I guess at this point we can get into another example of a feature of English. Specifically, now we're going to look at grammar that was preserved in American English, but changed in British English. And that is the past participle of the verb get. Now, I'm sure that learners have come across this in the past. I know I did. Uh, get in the past participle here is gotten, Gotten. The theory, I believe, is that looking at other verbs that follow a similar pattern, like forget or beget, led to make the change, or let's say preserve the change, but the form was simplified actually on the other side of the pond in the UK. And so you end up with got, G-O-T, as both the simple and the participle form of the verb for the past tense, which, if you're not used to that, it can really catch you off guard. I know that happened to me at some point. It's one of those differences that are relatively small considering. I mean, I guess considering everything else. But when you're not used to it, or when you're not expecting it, it really, gives you a bit of a pause. Like, wait a second, I thought that this was supposed to be like this because it sounds like. I mean, shouldn't there be a pattern? As in like forgot, forgotten, or get, got, gotten. It makes sense. It seems more consistent. There is one instance in which you have preserved gotten, but it's not in grammar. It's a fixed phrase, ill-gotten gains. You cannot change that expression.
And that's very interesting because if a student asked me, what does ill-gotten gains mean and why is gotten in there, I probably wouldn't know the answer to that question without knowing that actually it used to be gotten instead of got. And something that I found very interesting is I was on social media and I came across an American talking about their day, and she said, gotten. And I immediately, my spidey senses started tingling, and I thought that is incorrect grammar, and I had to go and look it up and find out, is it incorrect grammar or is it a difference between American and British English? So first of all, I say that to say, if you're learning English and you don't remember all the differences, most native English speakers don't know the differences as well unless they have taken the time to research them. And another thing that I wanted to mention as well is actually the pronunciation. When you say garten, I can't do an accent, but when you say it, to me, it sounds like Gaden. But of course, in British English, it's gotten. It's a very hard O and it's a very hard T. So even the pronunciation is different. So the first time you hear
Hmm.
that gotten in an American accent, you might not even associate it with the word got or get.
Especially if you're not used to that, common phenomenon in North American English of the glottal stop before an N sound. So, I mean, think of the classic example of mountain or fountain. That is so common in here, and so that's one of those things that also can catch you off guard. And yes, I can definitely see somebody not really picking up on it. Let's say when they first encounter it. Yes.
So one thing that English learners they like learning, they enjoy learning. Perhaps you also enjoyed learning it, but can be difficult because the meanings can be very different from the words themselves. Is of course phrasal verbs. So I have five typically British English phrasal verbs today. And then I think you're going to give us another five typically American phrasal verbs. So I just want to go through a couple. And the first one is, yes, it's very, very British. And I remember my mum saying this when I was younger, is faff around, to faff around or stop faffing around. And this means to waste time doing unimportant or silly things. So, for example, stop faffing around, stop faffing about. Doesn't matter if you use about or around, and get on with your homework. So, what would you say in American English instead of faff about, faff around?
The one that comes to mind more naturally for me is goof off. And the meaning is the same. You're just wasting time being idle and not, let's say, tending to your duties. Yes,
Almost like a very casual way of saying to procrastinate, right? Instead of
exactly.
stop
Yes.
procrastinating.
Yes, exactly. There's always that element of a lot of the time of phrasal verbs that they are simply a more casual alternative to, let's call them their one word counterparts.
Yeah, that's a nice term. They're one word counterparts. Okay, so the next one is to pop round. And this is to visit someone briefly or, unexpectedly without prior arrangement, without agreeing to do so first. So you might say, I'll pop round later and drop off the book I wanted to give you, or I'll pop round later and pick up my stuff. So it's a very casual way of saying, I'm just coming over quickly, 10-15 minutes.
What we would typically say here, and we actually have a range of options. One that comes to mind is to swing by, and the other one is to stop by. Um, Pop is actually that is so British. And whenever I think of the other examples, that I've heard, like I'm popping out or popping in, I think it is possible to say that here, but it has um has a different kind of ring to it, and it just simply strikes us as foreign. That's simply not our It wouldn't be, let's say, our instinctive way of speaking. That doesn't come to us naturally. We would understand. Pop, even in its, let's say, more basic meanings, it has this idea of spontaneity or something that is brief, as in I'm popping out or I'm popping in. Um, Maybe perhaps we would say like I'm stepping in or I'm stepping out for a second, to go get this or that or the other. But yes, I think when you try to, let's say, work out the meaning from the words themselves, you can kind of get some kind of an idea of what it is. It doesn't really work all the time. There are some phrasal verbs that are just absolutely insane. There's no guessing what the meaning is from the words. And I'll give one example in a moment, but I'm saving it for later.
Okay, well, I was about to say I have one. My next one is exactly that. You would never guess the original meaning of this phrasal verb. And you definitely, well, in my British mind, I don't think you would guess the actual meaning of this phrasal verb in American English. So typically, knock up in British English means to wake someone up, knock on their door. And this is very interesting because this used to be a job years ago, before alarm clocks were invented. Somebody was a knocker upper, and they would knock on everyone's doors at 6 a.m. and say, wake up, go to work. And they were the only people with the time. So they had to let people know it was time to wake up. So this is where this meaning comes from, is can you knock me up at 7 a.m. means to wake me up. Now, honestly, we would only use this in very small villages in the UK. You would not find this in big cities. People wouldn't use this terminology, and it's very old fashioned. But the interesting part is, as you know, in American English, to knock up means to get someone pregnant. So it's a completely different meaning. And I don't think you would ever
Wildly
guess. Yeah, I don't think
different.
you would
Yes.
ever guess either meaning if you saw the words knock up.
And that is so, you cannot say this around, I mean, let's just say that if you use this, let's say in its British meaning, it is one of those things that you can kind of picture this image in your mind of people just giggling at it because obviously the meanings could not be farther apart from one another. And I have no idea as to why it ended up having that meaning. I mean, there must be a very interesting history behind that one. I would say is still fairly common. I guess it would depend because I guess what we're most likely to say is to simply say that so and so got pregnant, and that's it. Just keep it simple.
A more common one that we use today is run rings around. Run rings around. Now, this means to outperform someone or be better than someone, but academically or with your skills. So, for example, you might say, she runs rings around her brother. She is more intelligent than her brother. She's quicker than her brother. But I think in American English, you'd be more likely to say run circles around, right?
That's right. Yes, this is one of those expressions that are basically, I mean, they are equivalent in meaning. There's just an element of it, like a part of it that changes. I actually did a live stream the other day with another British English teacher, and we went over some of these things. There are other expressions that basically one word changes, but the meaning is the same. Yes, this is interesting. This is one of those expressions that I know that I can identify. I know what it means, but I don't really use it myself. I would be more likely to simply say that so and so outperforms so and so, or just simply does better than somebody else.
Yes, I think when I think about this term run rings around, I mostly hear it with parents talking about their children. It's almost like a way of showing off, and you wouldn't use it with adults. So perhaps that's why it's not so common once you've kind of grown up. The final phrasal verb is, I think, one of my favorites because of where it came from, is to muck in or muck in. So an example would be, we've got a lot of cleaning to do, so everyone needs to muck in. it might be very difficult to guess the meaning of this, but it means to join in and help with a shared task or work. And I really like this phrasal verb because this comes from a time when almost everyone in England was a farmer. They worked on the land, they worked with animals. And typically in British English, when we're referring to the mess or the dirt that animals create, we call it muck. So to muck in means to put on your boots, your coat, your gloves, and clean the animal's mess. So that's where it's come from. And we still use it today, even though the majority of people in the UK do not work on farms anymore.
Yeah, that one was brand new to me. My guess is that if I say to you to pitch in, which is the American way, you would understand the meaning. If you said to me muck in, I would probably ask you what the meaning of it is because I had never seen it before.
What's very interesting for me, though, and we will see this when you go through your phrasal verbs in a minute, is that a lot of American phrasal verbs come from sport, but a lot of British phrasal verbs come from jobs and professions that people used to have, even if those professions don't exist anymore. So that was very interesting for me to see the difference.
Yes, you notice those things if you dig a little deeper into the history. All right, so that was five chiefly British phrasal verbs. Now let's go on to my side here. So we have ramp up. Typically, we use this, interestingly enough, and I seems to be the context that I try to associate with this verb, the context of business and production of something, like the production of goods for consumption. And so you talking about increasing the intensity, volume, or amount of something. The example here, reading, the company plans to ramp up production to meet demand. Typical example. Um, I guess that you would understand what that means. The suggestion here is that you are more likely to say step up, which we would use too. We would definitely talk about stepping up production or increasing it, just to keep it very simple. You know, again, that one word counterpart.
Yes, actually, it's very interesting because a lot of business English phrasal verbs in American we do use in English and I in British English, sorry. And I think that is because Americans and Brits have been doing business together for such a long time, and we look up to each other and we take ideas from each other. And you know, some of the biggest brands in America are the most popular in England and vice versa. So I think when it comes to business English phrasal verbs, we would say ramp up. A more British word, it's not a phrasal verb. We might say boost. We need to boost production. We need to boost sales. But definitely ramp up feels American, but we would use it if we're talking in a business setting, not in a casual setting.
All right, so our second example here of a mostly American phrasal verb is to buy into, meaning to believe or accept an idea, plan, or concept. And so we have here, she didn't buy into the idea that working longer hours would improve productivity. Now, this is interesting because at least according to our notes here, you are more likely to say to go along with, which is something that we would say too. But in my mind, the two phrases are slightly different in meaning. They're just something that is not a perfect synonym. What would you say about that one?
Interesting, because I think we would say buy or bought, past tense, but we wouldn't say the into part. So, for example, we would say she didn't buy the idea. Yeah, actually, as you say it, it does feel more American to me to say I don't buy that, I don't buy the idea. But I agree. I think in British English, we would be more likely to say go along with, or we would simply say the actual words, I don't believe it will work, or I don't believe that is productive.
Exactly. Yeah. It's again, the sometimes phrasal verbs just simply come more spontaneously or naturally, but let's just say that sometimes if you can just simply come up with the straightforward way to say it, again, there's nothing wrong with it. I let's say that I've had enough interactions with native speakers over the years, to notice that sometimes phrasal verbs don't really come to the surface. Let's say that readily. Sometimes people just simply stick to very simple language, and that's fine. There's nothing wrong with it.
Yes, I would completely agree. I think phrasal verbs, they maybe they add interest to what you're saying, and they may in some cases make it quicker, but not all cases. So if you ever feel, this is for anyone watching, if you ever feel that a phrasal verb does not feel comfortable to say, find another way to say it. It's absolutely fine.
Yes, paraphrasing. I would, call paraphrasing a skill of communication. And don't be afraid to use it. Sometimes the right word will just simply not come to mind. I get it. I've been there. So I know what that's like. Okay, so here we have this one here. So this will be number three on our list, to step up to, uh, meaning to take responsibility for something or to rise to a challenge. I believe, because the way that I have learned this expression is that you step up to the plate, meaning this comes from baseball here in the U.S. My guess is that we can use it in this way too, to mean that especially rising to the occasion. That's what it most likely, or let's say spontaneously, conjures up in my mind. You rise to the occasion. You step up to the plate. And so here we have an example. It's time for him to step up to his role as team leader.
Exactly. And I think we would be more likely to say, as you said, rise to the occasion, or we would actually say take more responsibility because that's what you're doing. It's not natural, I think, for us to say step up to.
Yeah, step up to a role, like it says here. All right, this one. I really like this one. And this just sounds so American. Hunker down. So it means to settle in for a long wait or prepare for difficult circumstances. And this one actually, obviously, since we had the COVID situation 4 years ago now, 4.5 years ago now, that was actually that was plastered all over the news. Hunker down. And so we hunkered down during the storm. I'm reading this example here until it passed. Now, this here says that you have two options. So let's just say two possibilities. You either stay put, which we would say as well, but we would never say this one here, to batten down, as in batten down.
So I have heard hunkered down a lot from the news, as you said, because of course America is prone to hurricanes, tornadoes, and you often see people are hunkering down during this storm or whilst the hurricane passes.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly. Especially like storm cellars or your basement. Yes,
yeah.
exactly.
Or actually, one of my guilty pleasures is storm chasers because we don't have storm chasers in the UK, and they often say things like that on the storm chaser programs. But we actually, it would be batten down the hatches. And I think, off the top of my head, most houses in the past in the UK had a basement, and they would close like this, so it wouldn't be a door to enter, it would be a hatch that you would close. And I think this is where it comes from, is to not only close the hatch but also put a load of weight on top of it, batten down the hatches. Yes.
I see. I think we can use it, but the meaning is more literal. And I always think of a submarine because they have hatches to get in and out. And so they batten down, let's say, when it's going to, submerge. But we would not use it, obviously, in the sense of, settling in and waiting out, let's say, you know, bad weather. And the last one here is to root for and, to support or cheer for someone or something, especially in sports or competitions. So I'll be rooting for our team in the championship game. We would say cheer for, which is what is listed here as your or your alternative, but rooting for it just sounds so, so American. It really does. Especially also, if I can just maybe add a quick pronunciation observation here. A lot of the time, there are verbs like this one here that we are going to do that glottal stop or apply that to. And so rooting for can sound a lot of the time as rooting for, as in I'm rooting for you.
Yes, yeah, I've heard that from cartoons actually rooting for instead of rooting for. And actually we do use this, but we're very aware that it's American. For example, if you go to the pub in the UK and there's a football team playing, you will say, "Who are you rooting for?" The alternative, we wouldn't really say cheer for because that's more the literal I am cheering. Um, we would say supporting. But if I went into a pub and said, "Who are you supporting?" People would laugh at me because it sounds very formal for that situation. So we would say, "Who
Yes,
are
this
you rooting
sounds
for?"
sounds a little bit too elevated, for the context.
Exactly.
That's it for the phrasal verbs. There are many more. Okay, so I did mention that there was one verb that I wanted to bring up just because if you look at it, and to be honest, I don't know what the what the first word here means, but I actually looked into it just a little bit more because I would not use this in American English. But the verb is to wheedle out. And it means that you are trying to get someone to respond or you're trying to elicit a response and they are reluctant, to speak. Wheedle out is chiefly or more commonly used in British English. The alternatives that it gave me for American English were just, let's say, more straightforward, as in you try to get something out of someone or you try to talk this out of whomever it is you're talking about. But the point is that if you only see the words wheedle and out, there's no way. I mean, I would not be able to guess what the meaning of it is. I wouldn't be able to work that out.
Yes, I know that phrasal verb. I've used that phrasal verb before, but I have never actually thought about that. And I haven't used it in a long time until you just mentioned it then. And I had a quick Google because I couldn't think of a simple example of where you would use that. But yes, as you said, it's like to convince someone or try and persuade them in some kind of way to do what you want them to do. Um, yeah, it's not common. It's not common, and you definitely couldn't guess the meaning. So that's a good spot.
And so, it's a very interesting one. It has kind of a nice ring to it as well. So maybe that's another reason why that it just stuck with me.
Mhm.
So you have lots of different varieties of English. I still believe that we have two dominant forms, American and British. And so we're going to talk a little bit about some of the typical concerns or questions that learners have, such as which one should I learn? Does it matter which way I go? Does it make sense that I try to keep up with more than one variety? So I'll just give my general remarks here. I've already kind of alluded to this in the past, but I do believe that you have to focus on one variety that will be your default. I don't believe we can retain too much if you get too deep into the weeds. And I still believe that there is a sufficiently shared, mm, let's say, language or structure that is applicable to all the major dialects. And so if you, let's say, let's just use that word here, the basic um, like the nuts and bolts of the language, the chances of a misunderstanding can be substantially reduced. I don't believe, that there would be significant breakdowns in your communication if you are, let's say, grounded in one of the forms of the language. That is really my basic advice. And something else that I would say there, just to add here briefly, I personally would not try to keep up with more than two major versions, let's call them versions of the language. Like I would not recommend that you try, let's say, to have your default and then two additional varieties that can be also quite different from one another. Like the example that I think of here is that obviously for me, American English is my default. That's where I have the foundation. That's where I built my foundation. And I am quite familiar with a lot of what happens in British English, but I would not take too much time or invest time in, let's say, exploring in detail what happens in Australian, New Zealand, or South African English. I would not do that because then it's just too hard to retain all of this information. That's my basic, advice.
Yeah. I think, as we mentioned before, and we did go into this in more detail in our previous video, so I'll link that down below for anyone that wants more detail on this, but it's being aware of why you are learning English. Are you learning English to go into the workplace? And if so, which kind of workplace? An American workplace, a British workplace, maybe an international one. So in that case, you can just choose which one you prefer. Do you prefer the American accent, the British accent? One thing that I spoke to a student about this week actually is that they were scared of the British accent because British people are more judgmental. I don't know if that's true because, of course, I'm not American and I don't live in America, but I do know British people can be very, very judgmental if your English is not understandable. Even if you speak good English, but you say one word incorrectly, they will form a judgment in their head. Um, so I can understand for a lot of people that trying the British accent is scary and it sounds more difficult than the American accent. But I completely agree with you. I think if you learn British or American accent, British or American English, those are the two major forms. Those are the two languages that people learn. So you're more likely to be able to communicate with others if you have a basis in one of those. And just be aware of what the differences could be. And if you are entering an American workplace, maybe research British business English phrasal verbs that I might come across so that you have that awareness.
Yes, and that awareness leads to adaptability. And the fact of the matter is, there is going to be contact or exchanges between the two forms, either through native speakers or non-native speakers, just interacting. Um, it will come down in the end to uh, what you're going to be using the language for. And let's say also what accessibility you have to, let's say, the forms. Like, let me just relay briefly, kind of like rehash a little bit of what I said in the past. As a South American, well, Colombian in this case, or we really only have, let's say, real access or ready access to American media. It is less likely or it's less accessible to have access to British media. I can think of a very good example. I remember that some of the TV channels back home years and years ago would have maybe one or two or three international news channels, and they were all American. I never saw the BBC. And so the access, let's say how easy access you have to one form or the other would be something to keep in mind. Um, and perhaps just one last thing here would be, let's say, numbers, as in population. There's roughly, I believe, something somewhere in the region of 400 million native English speakers. About, let's say, a little over half of that number are actually native speakers of American English, which is roughly somewhere around 220, maybe 30 million. There's actually a very significant, population of non-English speakers in this country. Maybe that's the reason why, we are seen as less judgmental of language proficiency because there's just so many of them. If you have the opportunity to interact with the native English speakers, numerically speaking, just by sheer numbers, cold hard numbers, you are more likely, I don't know to what extent, to encounter American English than any other variety of the language.
Yeah, absolutely. You're more likely to meet a native American speaker than you are a native British speaker. But as we have also gone through in our last video, um, British English is more taught in schools. So it completely depends on, first of all, your age, your accessibility, uh, if you're looking for free content or if you're willing to pay for content. It's all these things you have to consider. And now with YouTube, it's a fantastic way to have access to that because you just choose someone who you like the sound of their voice, their pronunciation, the way they explain things, and you say, okay, I'm going to learn from this person, and this is the English that I want to be learning.
And I'll just briefly add there are two things. So be consistent. If you're going to go with one form of the language, stick to the spelling conventions of that variety. So don't mix them up. That just doesn't look good.
Just to cut in,
Oh,
interestingly,
sorry. Go.
if you do a test and you mix up the British and American spelling, you will lose points in the English test because it's considered a spelling mistake rather than an active error of the spelling.
Okay, that is interesting. Yes, really the last point I wanted to make here is that when you say that British English would be more prevalent in education systems, is that this actually made me think of something that, you know, really didn't make sense to me back then, but I guess based on what you're saying, it does make sense now. I had to, there was a foreign language requirement in my school system. And I learned years after the fact that when I was in elementary or well, primary school, as you call it, we had textbooks that were in British English. And it's really interesting because you would have expected to see American English, textbooks or courses. But that was not the case, at least for what I'm able to remember. I mean, this was a long time ago, but when I looked into that later, this was a course series that I might have been Cambridge or Oxford, wasn't one of the American publishers. And so, there's, let's say, some anecdotal, evidence to that there.
Very interesting.
Just to try to bring this to a close, we have American and British English. We have the two most popular foreign language. There are differences. You can trace them back in history as far back as you like, or as the documentary evidence permits. Some of the differences are minor, like spelling. Other differences are more substantial. Differences in the meanings of phrasal verbs. Just to refresh your memory here, we got knock up, which is wild. I mean, the difference could not be any. There's a chasm of meaning there, and in the end, the form of English that you will stick to will be dictated by your individual needs, likes, and accessibility. In the end, all of these forms are mutually intelligible. We just, recommend that find one of them, stick to it, get good at it, and then you can begin to, polish some things here and there.
Exactly, exactly. Thank you so much, Jesus, for your insight. And it's always interesting as well to hear from someone that's actually had to learn the language actively. I didn't actively learn the language. I was just around it all the time, and it's my native language. But it's very interesting to speak to someone who has put in the years of hard work and has come across things that are difficult and you can't understand initially. So it's very helpful to me and to anyone watching this video, the insight that you have.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, always a pleasure to collaborate. And again, looking forward to more collaborations in the near future.
So that's it for today's video. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you enjoyed listening to the both of us talk, some differences between American and British English, and I hope it's cleared up for you whether you should choose one or the other, what you should focus on. If you have any questions for either myself or Jesus, feel free to let us know in the comments. As I said, check out all of Jesus's links down below. Subscribe if you have not already. And I'm going to go and rest now because I don't know if you can tell, but I'm not feeling very well today. I have a jumper on. My eyes are smaller than usual, so I'm going to go and find a good series and treat myself to a rest day. Enjoy the rest of your day and have a fantastic week. Bye bye.